I'm super excited to have with us today one of the lecturers in Women's and Gender Studies, Anna Mollow, who is a scholar and activist whose work seeks to advance social justice in regard to disability, fatness, queerness, race, and gender. She's the co-editor of the excellent anthology Sex and Disability, which is the first collection of scholarly essays at the intersection of disability and sexuality, and the co-editor of DSM Crip through Social Text, which is a collection of personal and political essays responding to the most recent version of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. In her published writing, Anna seeks to build bridges among various social justice movements, and her articles have made connections between disability rights and fat justice, queer theory and disability studies, and fat and LGBTQ plus activism. You're going to hear the word fat and figure out why we can just keep saying the word fat over and over again from Anna. Her forthcoming article in African American Review brings together arguments from fat studies, disability studies, critical race theory, and the Black Lives Matter movement to reveal the interlocking roles that racism, ableism, and fat phobia play in justifying police brutality against Black people.
So really, it's such a delight and such a pleasure to be here. This is my first semester teaching at Sonoma State, and I am just in love with this population. I'm in love with this campus. People are so nice. This is the only campus I've been to where if you go up to somebody and say, like, where is such and such building, which I'm frequently doing, that people will say, let me walk there with you. And that's just really just kind of encapsulates the feeling that I get. I'm so enjoying working with students in my class and other students who have come and talked to me. I've just been really impressed by how smart and thoughtful and politically engaged and socially aware you all are. So I'm just delighted to be here today. My talk today is called Fat Justice is Totally Queer. And Dawn was saying, oh, we're going to hear why we keep hearing the word fat. The word fat is used in an affirmative and empowering sense by people such as myself who are fat activists, who are part of the fat justice movement. And it's kind of like queer. So queer, as many of you already know, it's more than just having a specific identity. It's more than just being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, any of those particular identities, which are very important and are a very important part of queerness. Queerness goes beyond that. Queerness is like an attitude. It's a political orientation. It's a way of claiming space in the world, and I think of it sort of as like a gleeful and defiant and righteous and exuberant rejection of anybody in any social system that tries to constrain who we are and say that we're bad because we don't conform to some kind of norm. And I'm going to be making the same argument about fatness, and that when people use words like obese and overweight, that those are really harmful and damaging and stigmatizing words, and so instead we can proudly claim the word fatness. Before I get into my talk, I want to say a little bit about the day that it happens to be today. Today, some of you may know this, today is Holocaust Memorial Day. And that's a day on which Jewish people commemorate the lives and the deaths of the 6 million Jewish people who were murdered in the Holocaust by the Nazis. In addition to committing genocide against Jewish people, the Nazis also targeted a number of other specific groups and murdered members of those groups. One of those groups was lesbians and gay men. The exact numbers are not known, but it's estimated that between 5,000 and 15,000 lesbian and gay people were taken by the Nazis and placed into concentration camps, labor camps, where they were forced to endure absolutely horrific, devastating conditions, and the death rate in those camps was approximately 60%. Some of the ideologies that gave rise to the Holocaust share some striking similarities with the ideologies that in our present historical moment and location give rise to fat phobia. I want to point out a few commonalities. The first is the idea that simply by looking at somebody, you can tell whether they are healthy or sick, whether they are able-bodied and minded or disabled. We certainly see this today with fatness. There's a widespread cultural assumption that if you look at a person and you notice that this person is fat, that therefore you can determine that this person has all kinds of medical problems. During the Holocaust and in the years and the centuries leading up to the Holocaust, it was believed and promoted by medical authorities, the belief was promoted that Jewish people were intrinsically disabled, that we were prone to physical and mental illnesses, and that just by looking at us, just by looking at the shape of our bodies, the structure of our faces, our general appearance, you could tell something negative about our physical and mental health, and also about our character. So that's the first commonality that I want to note. The second commonality is the belief that people who are sick or disabled, whether physically or mentally, are a burden on society, and that society would be better off if we did not exist. And that was certainly one of the attitudes that was in circulation in the years leading up to the Holocaust. And the Holocaust, in the years before the Holocaust, the German doctors began murdering their own patients. They began murdering German people who they designated as unfit. And the way they did that was with a chemical called Zyklon B, which is the same exact chemical that would be used in subsequent years in the concentration camps when Jewish people were put in gas chambers to murder them with poisonous gas. This was the exact same chemical. So the way that they developed this technology was based on the belief that life would be better without disabled people, and so they were going to kill people. And again, this was doctors who were doing this, and they were doing this with the idea that this was a way to better society. And in fact, that they said that they were claiming that they were helping these disabled people because they were committing mercy killing, that disabled people were better off dead. So this idea that it would be better if we had a world where there were no sick or disabled people. And where did this idea come from? Obviously, there were many complicated roots to the Holocaust. There's anti-Semitism. There are many, many important factors. One factor was a scientific movement called eugenics. And this was a movement that did not originate in Germany. It actually originated in Britain and in the United States. This was a movement that said that the goal to having a better society is weeding out defective people. You want to encourage tall, blonde, healthy, able-bodied, muscular people who you call fit. You want to encourage them to reproduce, and you want to prevent everybody else from reproducing, seeing certain people as intrinsically less worthy than others. And when Hitler came to power, one of the things that he said right away is, Germany is behind. We need to catch up with the United States because they're doing a much better job than we are on eugenics. And one of his first actions was to pass a sterilization law requiring that so-called defective people be sterilized against their will. And he modeled that law after a piece of legislation that was already in effect right here in the state of California. So we see all of these commonalities here. I want to be absolutely clear as I'm talking about this that I am not making a comparison between the Holocaust and fat phobia as it is expressed in this country and in the world today. I'm not comparing, there's no comparison to be made between the extreme magnitude of that human tragedy. What I do want to say, though, is that when you really get down to the root of these problems, when you really look at it, at the end of the day, hatred is hatred, and oppression is oppression. And it is never okay to say, this kind of oppression happening to somebody else, this kind of oppression happening to me, that it's all right, that it's not that bad. Because hatred always does violence. It does physical and psychic violence. It is never harmless. It is never okay. And it's also really, really important as we move into this conversation about fat phobia and fat justice and queerness to remember that just because doctors and scientists are the ones on the front line saying, we are doing this for your own good, we are doing this for health, that does not mean that it's not oppression. That does not mean that it's all right. So now I'd like to move into my talk about fat justice and why I think that fat justice is totally queer. In the feminist movement, one of the key insights is the notion that the personal is political. And what that means is that political oppression is not just something that other people out there are doing, out there in some world that doesn't touch us, that all of these issues directly impact us every day in our lives. And that it's important, therefore, whenever you're talking about political oppression, to really think about how does this affect me? How does this touch my heart? How does this constrain my life? So I want to talk a little bit about why the issue of fat justice is so deeply important to me, so close to my heart for some personal reasons. I've already mentioned being Jewish, and so certainly living in a world where there's anti-Semitism, where there's a history of violence against Jewish people, has given me a really acute awareness of the damaging effects of oppression. Also, within the Jewish spiritual tradition, we have a value that we call tikkun olam, which means to heal the world or to repair the world. And that means that it's important when you see something that is wrong, see somebody being hurt, that it's really important to do something about it. Another reason that the issue of fat justice is so important to me is my family, in particular my queer family. When I fell in love with my wife, and we were married a few years ago, and I fell in love with her a good many years ago. She is like the most extraordinary, magnificent, and wonderful person that I have ever met, and I am so lucky and so blessed that she came into my life and that we fell in love. And when that happened, it was obviously a very queer thing because we're both lesbians and we're two women and we're falling in love and we're getting married, and that's a very queer thing. It was also a very fat positive thing at the same time because my wife happens to be fat. And so I was kind of violating two different social taboos at the same time. One is the idea that everybody's supposed to be heterosexual, and I wasn't doing that. And then the other one is this idea that everybody is supposed to only find thin people attractive, which is just completely ridiculous. It's just not even true at all. And sometimes when I talk about my wife and how much I love her and how I'm attracted to her, people say, oh, I get it, you have a fetish. Well, no, I do not have a fetish. That's a totally fat-phobic assumption to think that just because you're attracted to somebody who's fat, you must have a fetish. Or similarly, there's this idea that you have to like teach yourself and learn and work it up, and it's really just like anything else. It's that people have the capacity to have all kinds of different attraction and all kinds of different love. And what we learn from queer studies is let that happen. That's a good thing. Don't worry so much about the world that's saying, oh, you're bad if you do that. That's wrong. So definitely falling in love with my wife is very queer and also very fat positive. I also would like to take a moment to speak about my niece. She's my niece by marriage and my wife's niece by family lineage and by blood, and she is a fabulous and extraordinary lesbian, feminist, and fat activist, and she's also a fat woman. And so all of us, the three of us together, Jane and Jennifer and I, are constantly talking about these issues of queer justice and fat justice, and Jennifer actually makes a joke sometimes. She says that, it's kind of like the family business. Like, how sometimes there might be a family and it's like, oh, our family is in the upholstery business, or like our family's in the beer making business. So for us, our family, we're in the business of fat justice and queer justice. So fat studies and queer studies and fat justice and queer justice are just totally bound up with each other in my life. Also, I have some disabilities. People will look at me and say, but you don't look disabled, and of course that's because, as you know, not all disabilities are visible. And so because my disabilities are invisible, I often get like some real skepticism, like, is that really real? Are you sure you couldn't get over that? And I'm really struck by how often the messages and the unsolicited advice that I get is so similar to the advice that fat people get. It's always like, have you tried eating more vegetables? Because I never thought of that, right? How about kale? Kale smoothies, that will cure you. And then it's also about exercise. You really need to do more exercise. You need to do yoga. You need to do spinning. You need to do cardio. And the thing is, as most people with disabilities know, maybe you can do those things, maybe you can't, maybe you like them, maybe you don't. It all depends on your body. But if you have a chronic illness or disability, those things are not making that go away. We already thought of all that stuff. And fat people are getting the same exact thing all the time. Like, oh yeah, they never heard of kale shakes. Everybody's heard of kale shakes. Maybe you like them, maybe you don't. But drinking kale shakes, if you're fat, is not going to turn you into a thin person. And disabled people and fat people we also face access barriers that are very similar. So for me, I'm doing a lot better now, which is why I'm able to be here. But my disability is multiple chemical sensitivity. It's also called environmental illness. So I get ill from perfumes and fragrances and scented cleaning products, all those kinds of things. And like other people with this illness, I have found that it's really, really hard to get people to change, to switch to unscented personal care products, to switch to non-toxic cleaning products. And part of the reason that they don't want to do that is they kind of don't necessarily believe that it's real. They kind of think, you know, if I just tried harder, I could get over this. So why should they have to go to all of this trouble? And fat people have a very similar dynamic going on in their lives in terms of access barriers. One really important access barrier that fat people face, especially people who refer to themselves as super fat, very fat people, are chairs that are just too small, that they can't fit into. And so one of the really, really terrible instances of this is on airline flights, that fat people are forced to try to squeeze their bodies into tiny seats that they don't fit into, and then they're in a lot of pain from that, and then on top of that, the thin people on the plane have all this resentment and anger towards them as if they're taking up too much space, as if they have some kind of control over this. And it's this similar idea that, but if you just tried harder, you really could change this, and then you wouldn't be fat, and we'd all have room on the airplane, and that's not how it is. There was a list of further reading that was, I think it went up on Moodle for people who are in this class, and I also want to add to that something that you might take a look at. It's on, you can just Google Flying Wall Fat, which is an animated film by a fat activist named Stacy Bias. And it gives you a really, really strong sense of what it's like to be a fat person flying in a fat-phobic and inaccessible society. And there's one last, yeah.
I get a handout.
Oh, okay.
I have about 100 copies of it. If you're really interested in the further reading and you want a hard copy, take one. If it's okay to get it on Moodle, you can also grab it on Moodle.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. And I'm just going to say one last personal connection for me with fat justice, which is that I'm a woman. And those of you in the audience who are also women, you may have noticed that there are some extremely, extremely unrealistic expectations for how we're supposed to look and what size we're supposed to be. Men face this very much too, but for women it's a whole other layer of that. And for me, rejecting that is a very queer thing to do, because one reason that women are supposed to take up very little space and be very thin and do all this dieting is because supposedly that's going to make us more attractive to men. So as a lesbian, I can say, you know, I don't really care about that. But straight women and bi women and all kinds of women can say that too, because this is a secret, but it's really true. This idea that straight men don't find fat women attractive, this is a myth. There are plenty of straight women who do find fat women attractive. They may not always feel comfortable talking about it, but they are there, they're here, they're queer, and they're everywhere. So I've been talking about myself, and for a few moments I'd like to switch over and give you all the opportunity to talk to each other and maybe talk to me a little bit. So we're going to do a think, pair, share exercise, which is I'm going to give you a question in a moment. You'll have a minute to think about it, write down some notes for yourself, and then you'll have a couple of minutes to talk with your partner about what you came up with, and then we'll have time for one or two people to share what you came up with. So listen up, because here is the question. And actually, I'm going to start this with just like a show of hands, because I would just be really interested to see a show of hands on this question. The question is, how many of you have received the message? And you can receive a message directly by people telling you something to your face, or you can receive it from advertisements, from movies. You can receive it in all different places. So directly and indirectly received a message. It could be from family members, it could be from friends, it could be from doctors, television programs, news articles, billboards, what have you. Directly or indirectly receive the message that your body or part of your body is too fat, that it would be better if it could be thinner. And everybody who's raising your hand, I always say this in my class, raise your hand up like a full high hand raise so we can really see. So we have like pretty much almost everybody in the room, and I'm definitely raising my hand because I've definitely received this message. So most of us, not everybody, but most of us. So what you're going to do for 1 minute, and if you are not somebody who's received that message, you can have a variation of this, and I'll tell you that variation in a moment. But you're going to write for a minute about what happened how you received that message, and how you felt when you received the message. So what happened and how you felt. If you are somebody who has never received that message, then I want you to write instead about a time where you received a similar kind of message. Maybe that you were too thin, maybe that you had the wrong color of eyes, or the wrong texture of hair, or the wrong shape of nose, but something about you that just wasn't okay. And if you are the one person in the world that I have never met who never received any message like that whatsoever about your body, then you're a very privileged person. But what you can write about is a time that you heard, that you saw this happening to somebody else. So we'll take a minute now, take out a sheet of paper, and just write what comes to your mind. What happened and how did it make you feel? And Chris, if you could help me keep the time for 1 minute. Oh, that either that your body is too fat or that some part of your body is too fat. Did everybody hear the question and the assignment? Okay, so there's 1 minute, so you can finish that writing up. Okay, so the next step, hello? Thank you. The next step is that you're going to find a partner. And if you're sitting in a sort of oddly configured seating arrangement, you could have like a trio so that everybody's included. And you're going to take 2 minutes with each person talking for about 1 minute, just sharing with your partner, if you feel comfortable doing that, some of what you wrote about what happened and how you felt. So we'll take 2 minutes for that, and you'll be my timekeeper, right, Chris? Great. Sure, you can tell me that, yeah. So we're at the 1 minute mark. So just make sure to switch it up now so the other person gets to talk. Five seconds. Okay. Okay, great. We have time for, maybe 2 people or so. Would anyone be willing to share what was talked about in your partnership? Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for speaking about that. And I'm going to, everybody who says something, I'm going to repeat it back just so that everyone could hear and the microphone can pick it up and everything. So this experience of being bullied in high school and mistreated for being fat or for being a large person, and then when your weight changes and you become smaller, all of a sudden these same people want to be your friends. So really realizing how you're not being valued for yourself. Yeah. Any other observations that anyone could share? Yeah.
So I've been big since I was little.
Oh, sorry.
But I noticed like as a child I was like getting hurt and like think that I was like really bad person and stuff. But then now it's kind of more towards years. I realized like I either turn it around on people and be like, oh yeah, I've got 2 year olds and no boys jealous. Or like some other people I see who are like also struggling with body image and be like, I've been there, girl, like I got you. So it's been kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And just so everybody can hear and that we're getting recorded and everything, that it's an experience of always being fat and when you're younger, feeling really hurt by the bullying and the stigma. And as you get older, really taking on this kind of what I would describe as a queer attitude and being like, well, fuck that. I don't care what you think. And maybe you're just jealous of me. And also, I really liked what you said about having other people's backs when they're going through fat oppression and fat stigma. So yeah, these are really, really excellent, both of these. And thank you for talking about those. What I kind of think, when I looked around the room and saw all these people with their hands up about this idea that some part of us is too fat or that all of us is too fat, is that fat phobia, and this is really important, it affects everybody. It affects fat people more. Fat people get more stigma and more hostility. But every single one of us, even people who are thin, are affected by it. And in this way, it's very much like queer phobia. That with queerness, there's this idea that anybody could turn at any time. So, yeah, right? Right, so everybody who may not currently identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, or asexual needs to be monitoring themselves, needs to be watching themselves, because what if we cross over that line into that bad category and people start to not like us as much and people start to make fun of us? So we're all under this system in terms of heteronormativity and in terms of fat phobia, we're under this system of surveillance. So wouldn't it be nice? This is my idea. I mean, I didn't make up this idea, but this is my idea today. Like, wouldn't it be nice if we could just totally get rid of fat phobia? Like, just imagine that we're on a ship and we could like pick it up and throw it over the side of the ship and just say, be gone, we don't need that anymore. I think that would be really an awesome thing to do. And I think that we all can help to make that happen. I do want to say, though, because I know from past experience that when I've said this before, some people get really mad at me. And some people say, oh no, you cannot do that. I wrote an article for Bitch magazine a few years ago, and I got hundreds and hundreds of angry people writing to me because I was saying something very similar, like queer folks and feminists, let's embrace fat justice. And people said, you are going to cost people your lives. Being fat is going to kill people. This is about health. We have to stop this now. So I really wish that I had like another hour to take you through all of the medical information, and we just don't have time. But what I do want to tell you is a few key points. The main point is that what you're reading in the newspaper, what you're hearing from the medical profession about fat people is just not true. And if you look at the further reading list, there are tons and tons and tons of books and articles that are explaining this. But something to be really aware of is that doctors in the medical profession actually don't know everything. It seems like they do, they act like they do, but in reality they don't, and they are subject to stigma, to perpetuating stigma and prejudice just like the rest of us. In fact, there's a really strong history of that. I will do another show of hands, but I'm pretty sure I know what the result is going to be on these next few questions. How many people here believe that women should not engage in any kind of intellectual work? Because if we do, that's going to take all of the blood and all of the energy away from our ovaries, where it belongs, and take away from our sexuality. No takers on that. Oh, we have one, but I don't believe it. I don't believe you really think that. So nobody believes that. But not that long ago, this is what doctors and scientists were saying. This was a very common belief, very similar. And you can see how it's an anti-queer belief, because it's the idea is that women, our job is to be heterosexual, our job is to be at home with men, our job is to be taking care of men, and if we deviate from that, we're going to get some kind of disease. Now here's another one, and I'm almost sure I know we're going to get no takers on this one either. But how many people believe that people of color, especially black people, have too much sexuality, that they have some kind of innate biological sexual depravity, and that they need white people to help them keep under control? No. I'm getting laughs. Absolutely not. Because that's totally racist nonsense. That's just horrible, horrible, not true, totally not true lies. And yet, you don't have to go that far back in history to see doctors and scientists of the day, this was accepted scientific fact. The same way that we're always hearing now about the obesity epidemic, this is what we were always hearing about people of color. I will give you one more example, and I'm 100% positive that it's going to be all no, but I still want to be scientific about this. So the question is, how many people believe that homosexuality is a mental illness and that psychiatrists know how to cure it? Nobody. Does anybody know when that was taken out of homosexuality was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the American Psychiatric Association's sort of Bible of what counts as a mental illness? Does anybody happen to know what year that came out? I'm not sure. What you're saying is probably true about something because it's super complicated. Oh, and do we have another one over here?
Yeah, so technically it was taken out as a diagnosis in the 1870s.
Mm-hmm.
So now there's no longer it's no longer technically a mental illness stated by the DSM.
Right, yeah. And what you're saying, I want to look into that because I'm sure there's something to it. This is like a big, huge tome, so it's pretty complicated. But officially in 1973, only after pressure from political activists, by the way, not really from scientists so much, but from lesbian and gay and bisexual and trans people saying this is just kind of garbage, that finally they took it out. But it was only in 2013 that they removed gender identity disorder from that same manual. So up until then, if you were a trans person, you were officially a person who had a mental illness. So, so the point of all this is have a little bit of skepticism when you hear that something is a scientific fact, that a certain group of people who just happen to be oppressed and stigmatized are intrinsically ill. And now I want to spend a few minutes talking about how all of this medicalization is really kind of at the crux of what is so queer about fat justice. Because, first of all, we have this obsession that there must be some kind of cure. There must be some kind of way to change people. So weight loss dieting is actually a lot like gay conversion therapy. So gay conversion therapy is this theory that you can take us, you can bring us to psychiatrists, and then they can straighten us out and make us heterosexual. Fortunately, that does not work. Cannot be done. Also, fortunately, because we value human diversity and bodily diversity, you can't make a fat person, a person whose body is inclined to be fat, cannot become permanently thin. Yes, you see people go on The Biggest Loser and they lose a lot of weight. 95 to 99% of that time, all of that weight is going to come back. And in fact, there's going to be more weight that comes back because you're fighting against the natural way that your body wants to be. We say, oh, your pounds are going on vacation. They're going to come back with friends. So, So that's how that works, and that's a commonality. Another commonality is this obsession with what causes it? What causes it? And it's really uncanny because some of the supposed causes of homosexuality are very similar to some of the supposed causes of fatness. So one thing that they used to say, all the scientists used to say, is that people would become queer because they had an overbearing mother. Their mother was like paying too much attention to them and maybe being too nice to them. And we hear something similar to this with fatness. There's this idea that if you are fat, maybe it's because your mother fed you too much and loved you too much and gave you too much comfort food, so now you turn to food. All of this is completely bogus. There's no set way that fat people eat. There's no set way that thin people eat. We just all come in different shapes and sizes. Another commonality between fat and queer has to do with this idea of futurism. So many of you who are in this class today, you read an article that talked about some of the theories by Lee Edelman, a queer antisocial theorist, and he had this idea of what he calls reproductive futurism. And that's this idea, basically reproductive futurism is kind of like a story that some heterosexual people tell themselves in order to feel like they are better than some queer people. And the story goes like this. It says, well, here's the thing. Our sexuality is really noble. Our sexuality is really pure because it is all about procreation. Ultimately, we are about creating new life. Maybe sometimes there might be some circumstances where we might have sex and we're not exactly trying to have a baby at that exact moment. But even so, our sexuality is better than yours because we can make babies, and so we're thinking about the future. And so that's what Edelman calls reproductive futurism. In my work as a disability scholar, I coined a term that can sort of pair with that term, and that term is rehabilitative futurism. This idea that disabled people and also fat people and anybody whose body is outside of the norm, that we're always supposed to be looking towards this future time when we can be made more normal. So that's what rehabilitative futurism is, and you can really see that at work with fatness, because here's the story that some fat-phobic thin people tell themselves in order to feel superior to fat people. They say, my eating is all about the future. My eating is all about future health. I'm fighting the obesity epidemic. I'm thinking about living to be 95 years old, and that's why I choose kale, and that's why I choose salads. But fat people, they're just like caught up in their bodily need. They're just putting things in their mouth, just eating out of pleasure. They're not oriented toward the future like I am. And the answer to both of these stories is to say, actually, everybody's caught up in these drives. It doesn't matter if you are queer or heterosexual. It doesn't matter if you are fat or thin. Everybody has sexual desires and desires for food. They're very strong. They're very pleasurable. That can be really scary. It can make us feel out of control. But we don't need to rank people in order to manage that feeling of unsettledness and fear that we have. Another commonality is this idea that we're in an epidemic. When I used to do queer activism back in the 90s, when I first came out as a lesbian, there was this chant that I really liked where people would say, 1 in 10 is not enough. Recruit, recruit, recruit. And it was just silly because we're not trying to recruit anyone, but that's what everybody was so afraid of, that we have this epidemic that we're spreading. Also this idea that we are spreading something to children. Save our children was a big slogan in the anti-queer movement, that children were harmed, queer people shouldn't be able to teach in schools. And then we similarly see this with fatness, this idea that we have to end childhood obesity, when really that message is saying that fat children don't belong. And so that's actually very harmful to children. So I do want to leave time for Q&A, so I'm just going to try to cruise through this next part really quickly, but it is actually, in some ways, the most important part, which is like, we've talked about all this problem, but now the question is, what can we do about it? And I want to propose something that might sound pretty bold, but it's also pretty fun, I think, which is that everybody in this room can become a fat activist. And you might think, what? I do not have time to become a fat activist. Do you know how much studying I have to do? I just have no time. But here's the thing, the personal is political, and so that means activism can happen just by making changes right in your own self, in your own body, in your own life. So there's so much that you can do there, and all of it is really fun and really enjoyable. The first thing is stop dieting. If there's a food you're afraid to eat because you're afraid it's going to make you fat or make you fatter, forget about that. That's just nonsense. Just eat. Stop talking about diets. Stop putting down fat people. Don't laugh at fat jokes. say, give compliments to fat people. Don't compliment thin people for being thin. If you want to compliment a thin person, say, oh, I like your hair, I like your sweater, I like your glasses, but don't make it seem like thin is some kind of virtue and some kind of great thing. There's also a lot of like campus activism that you can do. You can start a group. We have the QSA, is it the Queer Straight Alliance or the Queer, yeah. So you can do something like that with fat. You could team up with the QSA and say, let's do a fat queer event. You can also teach yourself to look at fat people differently. We have been socialized to believe that fat equals unattractive, but that's just completely untrue. And you can start right now, you can, as you walk out of this room today, you can start looking at fat people differently and seeing what is beautiful and what is sexy. And by doing that, you've right there probably doubled the number of people that you can be attracted to. And maybe one of those people is the person of your dreams, and you would have missed out on them. One other thing that you could do One other thing that you could do is talk to your teachers, talk to the president of Sonoma State, Judy Sakaki, and say, we need more fat studies classes. We need more fat studies material on our syllabus because we're not getting enough of that. And they will listen to you. They do want to hear this information. When you go places, if you see that there are chairs that are not big enough for fat people, whoever's in charge of the chairs, tell them that. Say, this is really important. This is an access issue. This needs to change. So there's so much that you can do. And the main thing is to eat and to nourish yourself and enjoy your body and be happy with who you are. And so we do have time for, I think, a few questions. Yeah. Yes, question. I love it. Great question. And I will be repeating the questions back. That question was, who the hell do we talk to about these chairs? So let's find out the answer to that. Let's talk about that. Great. I love it. Okay, what other questions? Yes. Oh, that is so important. So this observation was really important in terms of especially thinking about eating disorders. And by the way, you do not have to be thin to have an eating disorder. Plenty of fat people have anorexia and bulimia as well. So when you see a person and they've lost a lot of weight, do not go up to them and say, oh, you look so great, you've lost a lot of weight, because what you're doing is reinforcing that eating disorder and that internalized oppression. Don't encourage people on their diets. If they say they're going on a diet, you might think you're being nice by saying, wow, this is really great, you're losing a lot of weight. But 95 to 99% of the time, that weight is going to come back. So what you're really doing is giving a put down to that future person who's going to be fat again. So again, compliment people for things that are not about weight, because weight is really not that important. Yeah, I think we have time for another few questions.
So what do you say then if you don't want to say, like, you look good or...
You can say anything in the world that you want. What?
Your hair looks good?
Yeah, say your hair looks good. So the question was, what do you say if you don't want to comment on people's weight? So really, this actually opens up a lot of possibilities, because you can compliment people for anything in the world, just don't compliment them for being thin, because that's like complimenting somebody for being straight. It's like, who cares, right? Yes, I saw a question. Was that a question or, yeah, yeah. Oh, that is a really, yeah, I'm just going to like join with giving you a hand on that one. So this question was, how do you talk to families about being less fat phobic? And I wish that I could say like, okay, here I have the magic answer. But what I would say is to really have a sense of alliance with other people, with fat people and queer people and other people, that we are in, people who are fat or queer are in a sort of unusual situation in regard to our families, because our families may not be fat and they may not be queer, and so we can actually end up feeling like outsiders within our own family. So my recommendation is always to speak from your heart, to talk about how things make you feel, rather than like saying you shouldn't say this, you're bad, but you absolutely get to say, this is what I need you to do, this is how I need you to talk to me. I know some fat people who have absolutely drawn a line in the sand with family members and have said, I will not discuss my weight with you. If you discuss my weight, I'm walking out of the room. I will not talk to you again if you discuss my weight. So there are many different approaches, and it is a really hard and challenging thing, and thank you for asking that question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.